The bitter wind howled through the city streets, cutting through layers of clothing like a knife. James shuffled along the icy sidewalk, his worn-out shoes barely protecting him from the frozen concrete. His once confident stride had been reduced to a hesitant shuffle, his shoulders hunched against the cold and against the stares of those who passed him by. He tightened his grip on the small dented cup in his hand, the same cup he extended toward strangers every day, hoping for spare change or, if he was lucky, a warm meal. 5 years ago, he had been the one looking away from people like him, people who stood on street corners with signs, their eyes hollow with defeat. Back then, James had been a man of means, a businessman with a sharp tongue and an even sharper sense of pride. He had owned a modest but successful construction company, wore tailored suits, and drove a car that turned heads. But his greatest mistake had been thinking it would last forever. His downfall had begun the day he handed his wife, Clara, the divorce papers. He remembered the cold finality in his voice when he said, "You'll never make it without me." He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that she would crumble. Clara had taken nothing from him, no alimony, no property, just her dignity and a quiet determination he hadn't noticed until it was too late now. As he stood shivering in the same city where he once dined in upscale restaurants, he wondered if she ever thought about him. Did she ever drive past these streets and glance at the faces of the homeless, or had she moved on completely? The thought gnawed at him more than the hunger in his stomach. He pulled his thin coat tighter, the fabric fraying at the edges. The winter had been merciless, and every night was a battle against the cold. A well-dressed couple walked past him, their laughter ringing in the air. The man dropped $1 into his cup without breaking stride, barely acknowledging his existence. James muttered a quiet thank you, but the words were lost in the wind. He stared at the crumpled bill, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. Once, he had been the one tossing spare change at strangers, never imagining that one day, he'd be the one holding the cup. Time had a cruel way of humbling a man, and as the snow began to fall again, James wondered if this was where his story ended, forgotten, frozen, and alone. Clara's fingers hovered over the keyboard as the morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office. The city stretched out below her, a glittering testament to how far she had come. 5 years ago, she had walked out of a crumbling marriage with nothing but 2 suitcases and a broken heart. Now, she was the CEO of Sweetrise, a boutique bakery chain that had exploded from a single storefront to 12 locations across the state. She still remembered the first day she had signed the lease on that tiny shop, her hands shaking as she handed over the last of her savings. The divorce had left her financially gutted, but it had also stripped her of fear. What did she have left to lose? She had spent nights kneading dough until her shoulders ached, mornings frosting cupcakes before dawn, and afternoons hustling to local businesses with samples. Every rejection had stung, but she refused to quit. Now her signature lavender-infused vanilla cake was featured in food magazines, and her cookbook sat on shelves in bookstores nationwide. Success tasted sweet, but it hadn't erased the past. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Ms. Hart, the Daily Tribune is here for your interview," her assistant announced. Clara smoothed her blazer and nodded. "Send them in." The reporter, a bright-eyed woman in her 20s, settled into the chair across from her. "Your story is incredible," she said. "From divorcee to millionaire entrepreneur in just a few years. What kept you going?" Clara hesitated, her gaze drifting to the framed photo on her desk, a snapshot of her younger self standing in front of her first bakery. Her smile hopeful but uncertain. "Anger, at first," she admitted with a quiet laugh, then determination, and finally, the realization that my worth was never tied to someone else's approval. The reporter scribbled notes eagerly. "Any advice for women starting over?" Clara leaned forward. "You're stronger than you think, and sometimes, the best revenge isn't success, it's peace." As the interview wrapped up, Clara's phone buzzed with a notification, a breaking news alert about the city's rising homeless population. A familiar face flashed on screen, and her breath caught. James, haggard, unshaven, wrapped in a tattered coat, the man who had once told her she'd never survive without him, was now begging on the streets. Her fingers tightened around her pen. Time had taken a turn indeed. The snow fell in thick, silent flakes as Clara stepped out of her town car, the warmth of the heated seats giving way to the biting December air. She pulled her wool coat tighter around her, her breath visible in the cold. The homeless shelter was just ahead, its windows glowing yellow against the gray afternoon. She had come to finalize the holiday donation from Sweetrise, 500 boxed meals for those without a place to go on Christmas Eve. She didn't expect to see him there, He was sitting on the shelter's steps, head bowed, a paper cup clutched between trembling hands. His coat was too thin, his shoes worn through at the soles. 5 years had carved deep lines into his face, but she would have recognized him anywhere. James, her stomach twisted. She could have turned around, she could have walked right past him, no one would have blamed her. Instead, she stopped in front of him. At first, he didn't look up, just extended the cup automatically, his voice rough from disuse. Spare any change. Clara didn't move. Something in the silence must have made him hesitate. His gaze lifted slowly, and when their eyes met, his entire body went rigid. The cup slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the concrete. Clara. His voice cracked on her name. She had imagined this moment 100 times, what she would say, how she would feel. But now that it was here, she felt nothing but a quiet, aching sadness. The man in front of her wasn't the arrogant, dismissive husband who had walked away without looking back. This was someone broken, someone who had lost everything. She bent down, picked up his cup, and pressed a folded bill inside. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small white box, one of Sweet Rise's signature cinnamon rolls, still warm from the oven. "Here," she said, holding it out. James stared at it, then at her, his eyes wet with something she couldn't name. Shame, regret, hope. Why? He whispered. Clara hesitated. Then softly, because no one should be hungry on Christmas, and with that, she turned and walked inside, leaving him there on the steps, holding the box like it was the last good thing left in the world. The cinnamon roll sat untouched in James' lap, its sweet aroma cutting through the stale city air. His fingers hovered over the box, afraid to open it, as if the simple act might shatter this fragile moment. Clara had walked away without another word, disappearing into the shelter like a ghost from his past. He should have felt humiliation burning through him, should have tossed the box in the nearest trash can and slunk back into the shadows where he belonged. But he did, in single quotes to Dot instead. He lifted the lid. The roll was perfect, glazed golden brown with swirls of cinnamon peeking through. A memory hit him like a punch. Clara in their tiny apartment kitchen, flour dusting her nose as she laughed over a lopsided batch of cinnamon rolls. Someday, I'll open a bakery, she'd said. He'd scoffed, told her to focus on something practical. His throat tightened. Carefully, he tore off a piece and brought it to his mouth. The flavors exploded, warm, buttery, exactly how she used to make them, only better. Professional, successful, everything he wasn't anymore. A crumpled flyer blew against his shoe. He picked it up, smoothing the creases. Sweet Rise Bakery now hiring. Second chances program for those rebuilding their lives. A phone number glared up at him in bold print. His hands shook. Was this pity? A cruel joke? He glanced at the sheltered doors, half expecting Clara to emerge and retract the unspoken offer. But the doors remained shut. Snowflakes settled on the paper, melting into tiny dark spots. He thought of the last 5 years, the gambling debts that swallowed his business, the eviction notices, the nights spent pretending he wasn't drowning in regret. He thought of the way Clara had looked at him minutes ago, not with triumph, not even with anger, just sadness. A gust of wind nearly ripped the flyer from his grip. He held on tighter. Somewhere inside that building, Clara was handing out meals to people just like him. People who'd fallen through the cracks. People who needed someone to believe in them, even when they'd stopped believing in themselves. James tucked the flyer into his pocket, next to his last dollar bill. The cinnamon roll box he kept cradled in his hands. Empty now, but somehow heavier than before. He had a decision to make. The bell above Sweet Rise's flagship store jingled as James pushed open the door, the warmth of the bakery wrapping around him like an embrace. The scent of freshly baked bread and caramelizing sugar filled the air, so rich it made his empty stomach clench. For a long moment he stood frozen in the entryway, his worn sneakers sinking into plush carpeting that probably cost more than he'd earned in the past year. Behind the counter, a young barista glanced up. "Welcome to Sweet Rise, sir. What can we get started for?" Her cheerful greeting faltered when she took in his appearance, the frayed cuffs of his jacket, the shadows under his eyes. James saw the exact moment she categorized him as someone who didn't belong here. He was about to turn back when a voice cut through the tension. James. Clara stood in the doorway to the kitchen, flour dusting her apron, her hair pulled into the same messy bun she'd always worn while baking. The years had softened her edges where there was once guarded tension in her shoulders. Now there was an easy confidence. The flyer burned in his pocket as he forced the words out. I saw your hiring notice. His voice sounded foreign too, his own ears rough from months of disuse. Silence stretched between them. He watched emotions flicker across her face. Surprise, hesitation, something that might have been pain. The bakery hummed around them, customers chatting, espresso machines hissing, all oblivious to the earthquake happening in their midst. Finally, Clara stepped forward. "We open at 6 a.m., she said, her voice steady. "The dish pit needs someone reliable. It's not glamorous work." James blinked. This wasn't forgiveness. He knew better than to expect that, but it was something far more valuable, a chance. "I'll be here at 5:30, he managed. Clara nodded, then turned back toward kitchen, but not before he saw it, the slightest softening around her eyes. The ghost of the smile she used to reserve just for him. As the door swung shut behind her, James exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in quiet possibility. Somewhere beneath the layers of regret and shame, something long dormant began to stir hope.